started. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, sorry. Gotta get our interpreter situated. Oh, the mic for the interpreters? Do you want to?
We're going to be we'll be standing all the time.
Yeah.
After introductions, I'll stand.
Okay, are we ready? So, my name is Amy Mielek, and I work here at the hospital on the cochlear implant program, doing psychosocial evaluations for kids and families prior to getting cochlear implants. And we have tonight both ASL interpreters and C-sign interpreters, so if you're trying to figure out why we have multiples, that's why. Our topic tonight is deaf culture from the inside out, and the presenters have asked if you have questions that you wanted answered tonight regarding the deaf culture and deaf community, that you write them down, and Lisa, who has coordinated all of this for us, has little note cards, so she can pass those out, and if you want to jot down some questions and then kind of just hold them back up so Lisa can pick them up, and then we'll make sure they get down to the presenters so that we can try to get, and it's fine to, as the discussion goes, raise your hand and ask a question, but sometimes passing the cards off gets it going a little bit, because sometimes people are afraid to ask questions. So tonight we have with us Brenda and Aron and Len Aron. And Brenda is an instructor at Seattle Central Community College in the interpreter training program. She is the fourth child of a deaf family. Her parents and her three older sisters are all deaf, and also has deaf relations on both sides of her family. Len is an educational specialist in K-12 public schools on Mercer Island, and also works in Kirkland at the Lake Washington Technical College. He was a former superintendent at WSD, Washington State School for the Deaf. He is hearing. He and Brenda have been married for 28 years, which is an accomplishment in itself. Brenda and Len have extensive experience, both personally and professional, working with students who are deaf and hard of hearing, parents and professionals. Together they value building partnerships and seek to help parents take a lead role in choosing philosophies that best fit their family's needs. So I'd like to introduce Brenda and Len, and if you have your card filled out, just kind of raise it and Lisa will come by. And if you guys want to just kind of start off, I know you have a slide show over here, and so I'll get out of the way.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. The last time my husband and I agreed to present together was about 27 years ago. In our first year of marriage, we were invited to sit on a panel of deaf and hearing couples, which was quite rare back then. You didn't often see deaf and hearing people married. So we agreed to join that panel, and after that, we almost divorced. So we have never presented together since until tonight. So this is our second official presentation, and we're hoping we will still be together after tonight, but I think we should be okay. I want to briefly explain what our plan is for this evening, so you have a sense of where we'll go in our presentation. First of all, we would like to share our personal stories and share our presentation statement, and we'll give about an hour and a half presentation on deaf culture, and then take a break. I promise you will not be sitting the entire evening. And when we come back, we'll have a question and answer session, okay? And we'll also have some closing remarks. All right, take it away.
The lecture that or the presentation we're doing tonight is not, it's not academic. It's based on our years of working with people, socializing, getting to know other families through our work, and knowing our own family and many of our extended family members. Both Brenda and I have had experience doing research in graduate programs and at the work site. That's not what we want to do tonight. You can go to many, hopefully you can go to many places to get that information. This is an excellent institution that can either give you that information or can lead you to wonderful resources in the Seattle area. But that's not what we're going to do tonight. This is one viewpoint or perhaps two viewpoints, and it's from our hearts. And we're hoping that what that permits is that as you're listening to some of our stories and perspectives, that it might give you an opportunity to think of some questions that you really would like to ask, or some topics you'd like talked about that maybe are awkward and uncomfortable. Most of the information is what we call plain common sense. And I thought a lot about that statement because we don't want it to sound that if you have a different perspective, that yours is not plain common sense. But I guess that's what we've come up with after the years of battling and learning and working with people, that in the end, as parents who have raised two girls, you know, raising children is difficult, no matter what the situation is. So at this point, we're labeling it common sense.
You know, I have to admit, I was the one that made that common sense statement. Len wasn't altogether comfortable with it, but I insisted that we leave it in there.
Okay, I think it's important to get some background on the two of us. I grew up in a family that is hearing. My father's was a physician, and for 40 years, that was his career. And my mom is a nurse of 60 years. So what's important to me is that I grew up in a family, we knew nothing of deafness. I'm not sure I met a deaf person my entire life as a member of the family I grew up in. My father had a great respect for science and technology, and I learned a lot about that at our home. We would talk about, you know, stuff that you talk about when you grow up with a doctor and nurse for parents. I also am a kind of a sci-fi fan, and you know, things like Star Trek really excite me because it's an application of technology and innovation and positive, I think, applications towards culture and some of the good things that we believe science can do for us. So I came from that hearing perspective and a very strong science perspective. I went to school and got a bachelor's in biology, and, you know, just really have I think a foundation in science and technology. English is, without doubt, my first language. It's what I grew up with. It's what I heard. It's what I went to school with. It's my friends, family. My parents are very well read. We have a lot of respect for the written word. English is my first language. I'm a SODA, which is kind of a cute little acronym for Spouse of a Deaf Adult. And how we met, I was working in a rehab center for adults who lose their vision, and at this particular place that you're able to stay there for 6 months and learn how to reacclimate to the community and the skills that you need after you've lost your vision. I was one of the counselors on staff and had been there a short time, and only a few weeks and standing in the hallway and looking at the end of the hall. I see this lady walk by kind of at the end of the hallway with long, pretty red hair. And I said to one of my colleagues, "Who is that?" And he said, "Oh, she's the deaf teacher." And I thought, deaf teacher? What's a deaf teacher doing in the blind rehab center? And that's what I said. What do you mean the deaf teacher? And they said, well, he explained that sometimes a person who's deaf who loses their vision also needs that kind of rehabilitation, and it's a small program within the larger program I was working at, and it just so happens she is deaf because she can work very well with individuals who are deaf and blind. That's how we met. That's my version of it.
Well, like Amy mentioned, I'm deaf, born into a deaf family, and I am the youngest of 4 deaf girls. My mother tells me the way she found out I was deaf was after I was born. I was in a nursery in the hospital. You know how it was in the old days where all the babies were laid out in one room. And my mother came to the window and she spotted one baby that was, crying and screaming, I'm sure very hungry. And there was a chain reaction then when every other baby started to cry and scream, except for one that remained very peacefully asleep. And my mom knew that was me, the deaf one. So I have aunts and uncles on both sides of my family who are also deaf. So when I was young, I just assumed the world was half deaf and half hearing. I just thought that was natural. My family signed, and other families and some relatives of mine also knew sign. And then the neighborhood kids all used their mouths to communicate. And I remember even asking them to try to sign to me, and I couldn't understand why they were jabbering their mouths and their hands weren't moving. I asked my mom, what's wrong with these kids? And my mom said, no, they use speech, they can hear. And I actually kind of felt sorry for those kids because they couldn't use their hands to communicate. I just didn't understand the difference between being hearing and being deaf. And then I realized the world was not really half deaf, half hearing. It was really hearing with a very small minority of deaf people. My family used American Sign Language as our main mode of communication in the family, but my mother also fingerspelled the English language and read and wrote to us. She loved books, and I remember every night when it was bedtime, my sister and I would look forward to my mom telling us bedtime stories after we got cleaned up and brushed our teeth. She would read books to us and then sign them to us, sign the stories. And I was always thinking she was making up the stories, and she said, no, dear, they're from the books. I couldn't imagine how much information was put in books. It was amazing to me. And I started reading at an early age because of that interest, because of that love. So I consider myself bilingual in both English and American Sign Language. I went to an oral school when I was young. I mean, strangely enough, even though I was from a deaf signing family, I went to a school that insisted on using speech and lip reading. And I remember even my teachers telling me, Brenda, you must stop signing, it's bad. And I was really puzzled by that. My parents signed, my siblings signed, I loved my family, I knew they loved me, my aunts and uncles all used sign language, how could it be bad? So I became quite a rebellious youngster and I refused to learn speech. That was just my reaction at the time. So I'm not a very clear speaker and I'm profoundly deaf. I can lip read fairly well, but when people ask me that question, can you lip read? I want to ask them the same question back. Can you lip read me? I mean, we all struggle with lip reading, right? Everyone speaks differently. Some people are very clear in their enunciation and others are not. How can you expect me to be a lip reader all the time with all those different mouths out there? Let's see. What else do I want to say about being a deaf adult? I consider myself deaf. I know other people use the term hearing impaired or a person with a hearing loss, but I call myself deaf and I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of that identity. I use American Sign Language as my mode of communication. Now, how I met Len. Well, his story, he talked about working in the rehab center and spotting, working with blind individuals. It was actually the Chris Cole Rehab Center in Texas. And I had been working there, I think I was into my 3rd year, working with deaf-blind adults who were born deaf, using American Sign Language as their primary mode of communication, and then somehow began to lose their vision. So they needed to learn different skills in life, how to be mobile, for example, how to learn to cook independently, to clean, those types of things. So we were teaching them skills regarding their hearing loss. The vision loss. And I remember it was the Sadie Hawkins Day. Do you remember this in the old days when girls used to chase after the boys that they liked and got to ask them for the date? This is sort of an old tradition. It was never appropriate for a girl to ask a boy for a date at that time, but Sadie Hawkins Day, it was considered all right to do that. And I was doing some support service work, so I was considered a support service provider or an SSP with a deaf-blind individual, a woman who wanted to go ask a man for a date. So I was basically guiding her so she could go up to the man that she liked and ask him for a date. And I can't remember how it worked, but it was sort of a game people would play where someone would play the pastor and actually marry these two individuals. Well, the person that I was guiding would chase up a boy who had climbed up into a tree, and she wanted to follow him up into the tree. So as her guide, I had to guide her up to the tree, literally, and climb the tree with her so she could ask him to marry her. Anyway, then later in the day, we had a 3-legged race, and she and I were tied together, leg to leg, to compete in this race. And I was watching all of this activity going on at one point, and I happened to notice a man. He came up to me. He was pretty good looking and signed to me, and very beautifully signed, "Will you be my partner?" I was very surprised. I recalled seeing this man from time to time before, but I didn't know that he knew any sign language. And I was so excited. I said, "I can't believe you know sign. How do you know sign?" And he got a little overwhelmed when I started signing to him so quickly. And then he turned to his friend. He actually only knew one sign. He only knew one sentence, which was, "Will you be my partner?" So he had to get a little more support after that when I started asking him questions. Anyway, then we joined the 3-legged race together, and we won. Of course, we were the only sighted people in the race, so it was a little bit unfair. We were able to make a beeline for the final, the finishing line, and everyone else was having a little trouble finding it. But anyway, after that, he asked me for a date, and the rest is history. Now, I have to say, being from a deaf family, all of my siblings had married deaf individuals. I was the only person to marry a hearing person. And my parents, at first, were quite reluctant. They were not very happy about this. They felt that there was a high divorce rate among deaf and hearing couples. And it took them a couple of months after he proposed for me to really think about it and then finally say yes. The poor man had to wait 2 months before I even agreed to marry him. But we've been married for 28 years now, so I don't regret that. Okay.
Okay, we hope that through this presentation today we can also demonstrate some things that we're talking about. And one of the aspects has to do with comparing ASL to English. And they are described as one being low context and one being high context. English is looked upon as a low context language, and we're going to explain more as time goes on. ASL is more high context. If you look at when we talked about how we met, my description took about 2 minutes. I basically tell you how we met. Brenda, and I did that in English. Brenda's description of how we met was much more expansive. It set the stage in many ways, who, what, where, how, and a lot of information. That's inherent to the nature of ASL. It's a high context language. It requires that kind of setting of information. And we'll talk more about that when we compare English and ASL because of the impact that has on raising children who are deaf.
to speak a little more about culture. When we looked up culture in the dictionary, we found 28 different definitions. My God. So we chose at least I chose the definitions that I felt fit best. First of all, it's a set of learned behaviors of a group of people who have their own language and beliefs and their own customs that are accepted within that group. Usually, a culture shares the same language and traditions. The other definition talks about how culture comes about amongst a group of people. They share similar experiences, common interests, shared norms of behavior, and shared survival techniques. And that's very true for deaf people in deaf culture. So that's just a general definition of culture. Now, tell me, how would you define American culture? What are some aspects of American culture? It's hard to explain, isn't it? Could you give a presentation on American culture? It's quite challenging. I remember asking some researchers who were from other countries what American culture meant to them, and they told me it meant hot dogs, French fries, and apple pie. I said, okay, well, yes, some people love that, but we don't eat that every day. I said, give me some other examples. They said, well, Americans are all wealthy. Well, that's not necessarily true. I wish I was one of them, but when I asked them for more information, they said, oh, well, the roads are paved with gold in America. I said, where is that? I'd sure like to see those streets, right? But that's an outsider or foreigner's view of our country. American culture is very broad, and so is deaf culture. There are many, many aspects to it. We're choosing some of those aspects to share with you tonight, but please don't assume that from what I share with you explains all of deaf culture. If I told you all about it, you'd be here all night and you'd be bored to death. So we don't want that to happen, all right? Oh, I forgot to add too. One other thing that I had asked this group of researchers was what American culture is like, and they said cowboys. I'm like, well, okay, I don't know where they are, but I guess they're out there somewhere. That's just to give you an overall view of the deaf community. If you think of the deaf community as the larger circle, we have within the deaf community people who have very different experiences. Some people who are late deafened, meaning they're hearing and then later lose their hearing. Some people have cochlear implants. And if you don't know what that is, that's a device to help a person hear that requires a surgical implant. Similar to a hearing aid, however, it's surgically implanted, and I'm not an expert on this, so it would require someone else to give you the definition of a cochlear implant. But basically, it's a device to help people hear. Certain people have those. There are also people who are hard of hearing, meaning they have some residual hearing. There are people who consider themselves deaf, as in deaf cultured. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these groups are isolated and separate from one another. There's a lot of overlaps. We do share a lot in common, and we do interact with one another over different political issues, sometimes at different events. We support one another's activities. So there's a lot of overlap. People who consider themselves, who are physically hard of hearing, may still consider themselves part of the deaf culture and use American Sign Language. There are other people who are hard of hearing and would rather interact with hearing people and only use oral or spoken language. Some people go back and forth between those two groups, and that's fine. People with cochlear implants don't necessarily only associate with other people that have cochlear implants. They are welcome to join deaf community events where sign language is used. Some deaf people choose to attend lectures or presentations where cochlear implant users are the main population. Let's see. Also, some people who are late deafened. I actually attended an event recently just to understand a little bit more about the experience of late deafened individuals. So again, I don't want to suggest that any of these groups are completely isolated from one another. We do interact, and there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of variety within each one of these groups. And we do come together for the common good, because many of us have very similar experiences, no matter how we live our lives. Now, speaking within even the culturally deaf group, we have people with different ethnicities, people from East India. They may have a deaf event that's an East Indian event, and they invite people who are not of their ethnicity to join them. People with various sexual orientations, gay or lesbian groups. There are people who affiliate over sports. There are a lot of athletes that get together. So within all of these groups, there are subgroups that tend to interact with one another over interests, or maybe they have work relationships together. Maybe they're geeks that all work in the computer industry. That's not something that I would understand, but they do share those interests. Okay, does that make sense? Great.
In thinking about culture and where you fit in, you need to talk about values. And here's a definition of values, that they're rules by which we make decisions, what's right or wrong, should, shouldn't do, good or bad. Also tell us what's more or less important. And to me, things that I value are diversity, working in a community, living in a community where you have people who are different from each other. Another example of a value is honesty. And I think all of us could identify different values that are important to us. And that relates to the culture, the group you belong to. Also the notion of beliefs. And usually beliefs is something you have an emotional connection to. I believe in God. That's a very strong, that's very personal. And that's an example of a belief. The deaf community has its own values as a group. And if you're part of that large D community, you don't view it as a disability. And you see American Sign Language as the primary language. And what's a little bit unusual about deaf culture in America is that it's also part of the larger American culture. Yet you still have to retain your own beliefs and values. I think it's important to talk about this a little bit. I've lived in other countries, and when living in other countries, if I see other Americans, I go towards them. I want to sit and talk to somebody. If I'm the only one by myself, and I've lived in other countries. I'm in Africa, and everyone's black, and I'm white, and everyone's obviously African, and I'm a white American, and I see another American, no matter if they're black or white or Hispanic, I would go over to that person. They'd come over to me. There's a connection. Bring that into the United States. The fact that I know sign language, that I know a lot about deaf culture. If I'm anywhere in the United States and I go into a restaurant or a store, the mall, at some kind of event, I see someone who's signing. It's something you develop in terms of a feeling. It's also part of etiquette and being polite. I would probably go over to the person and say, "Oh, are you deaf? Or are you you're an interpreter? Are you signing?" There's something there that I'm sure there are very good words for that, but it's kind of a feeling that you have when you're kind of going through your daily life, and you see someone that you have a connection, and you go over to them. So again, kind of making comparisons between, we talked about, gave you a working definition for values. Comparing deaf and hearing values. For me as a hearing person, I place great value on being an individual, who I am.
Really? Boy, deaf people value collectivism. We support one another as a group. Interesting.
Also, I place a lot of value as a hearing person on my American identity. That's who I am. I'm an American.
Huh. Well, yeah. Just like I'm proud to be a deaf person. That's where my identity lies.
Also, in terms of what I had mentioned before, low context. When I speak, I'm able to be very clear using the vocabulary, and to me it's very direct. Doesn't require a lot of description, and that's referred to as low context.
And you know, sometimes I just don't understand that. The ball was thrown by the boy. Well, why not say the boy threw the ball? That'd be more direct, wouldn't it? I don't understand English sometimes. Or it is known that deaf people are very emotional. It is known? Who knows it? Who says it? Known by whom? I don't understand that. You'd have to say, people all over know that deaf people tend to be more expressive, not emotional, but expressive in their sign. You know, they use grammar and facial expression. So low context can sometimes be very vague for those of us in a high context culture. We need things to be more clear and state who is doing what to whom. Interesting. Now, in high context culture, English, of course, has the advantage of using intonation to help people understand the meaning. Whereas in ASL, I have to use my facial expression, my body movement, and my hands, and the actual signs that I'm using to help you understand what I'm saying. And that is high context.
As a hearing person, my language is auditory. To me, I mean, I know there's text, there's a lot you look at, there's TV, and, but in terms of learning my language and using it, it's auditory. It's based on being able to hear. That's important to me.
My language is a visual language. So I have to see the whole picture. I have to visualize what's being said. That's why English sometimes is still a struggle for me, even though I grew up reading English and I'm very fluent with it. But do you know there are 28 different definitions of the word, or different rules behind the word the? You have to hear it to understand it. It's not just something you understand by reading it. And that's why sometimes I still struggle. I'm not sure, should I put the article the here, or should I put it there? I'm not always sure, and I have to double check.
My language is English. As a hearing person, I depend on that for information. I depend on that to be able to tell people what I'm thinking, how I feel. I use English. That's my main language.
And my primary language is American Sign Language, or sign. And I learn the language visually. Of course, as I said, I do read English and I write English just fine. But I don't speak English, and I don't depend on lip reading as a means of understanding the language. I used to do it more, but there was too often misunderstandings, and I prefer to write to get the correct understanding. For example, one time I went to a bar with a group of women friends. One woman just got engaged, and we got together to celebrate. And I wanted to get a drink, so I went over to the bar to order, and a man started talking to me. And I was really struggling. I wasn't interested in trying to lip read him. The environment was sort of dim. It was very challenging to read his lips. So I pretended to understand what he was saying to me. And when I came back, I saw that he had given me a card with his phone number on it. He handed it to me. And he wrote down 7 p.m. on the card. And I asked my friend, what does he want? She said, he's expecting a date with you. You said yes to him. And so I had to quickly gesture that, no, I didn't understand him. I didn't hear him at all. And I realized I can never fake it again. It's too dangerous to nod your head when you don't really understand.
As a hearing person, I've learned, I grow up always hearing, it's important to follow your commitments, be on time, school, and especially on the job, that what's valued is, can you show up every day? Can you be on time? If you say you're going to meet at a certain time, be there. That's been drilled into me, I think, as part of American culture, but as a hearing person, you hear about the value of being on time. It's a sign of responsibility.
And deaf people also value time, especially when it comes to the work environment, or if they have a doctor's appointment. We understand the value of being on time. But outside of those environments, when we're having social time with deaf friends, well, then we call it the 7 stages of leaving. First is the goodbyes, waving goodbye to people, taking a step away, and then coming back and saying, oh, by the way, I forgot to ask you, what time are we going to meet next week and where? And then maybe once you've got that cleared up, you step away a few more feet and then realize, oh, by the way, is it okay if someone else joins us for dinner next week? And then a couple more steps away. So it takes several stages of goodbyes. Even by the time you're in your car, you may be backing out of the driveway and then remember some more things you want to talk about before you go. My poor husband has had to put up with my deaf time for so long, and watching those 7 stages of goodbyes. My goodness, if someone were just to get in their car and take off, it would not feel normal. It doesn't feel right to us. There's a way of leaving. Whereas with Len's family, we say our kisses, we say our goodbyes, and we're out of there. And I never understand why we don't take our time saying goodbye to them. It's just different culture. But it's still challenging for me to get used to his sense of time, and probably challenging for him to get used to my sense of time.
And even though we're doing this point-counterpoint, I would like to interject that there was one time when we were at an event, and I think that we were visiting friends, and I think they were all deaf. And Brenda was doing her 7 stages of goodbye, and I mean, this is written up, and it's been researched. And Len left at about stage 5. I got in the car and left. It was like 11:30 at night. I'm not sure Brenda knew until about stage 6 or 7 that her ride was gone. So it's real. It's real. I used to think it was just woman culture, and don't sue me for sexual harassment. Just an observation as who I am, but I'm not sure. But there is something there. There's something there. Okay, as far as being a hearing person, when I thought about the word music, for anyone who's been in a middle school bus, what are kids doing? Especially, people are singing the songs that they're hearing on somewhere, their iPod, the music, radio, wherever they're getting it. You just grow up with that stuff. It's just part of you. I play different instruments. I got a lot of support from my family to do that, to take lessons. And in most jobs I've had, I've used my music in jobs to contribute to whatever's going on. And when I think about music, and this may be true for anyone in the room who's hearing, if an event happened 10, 15 years ago in your life, and there was a song associated with that or a time in your life, it just, blank out, and it pulls you right back emotionally. That is very unique, I think, to a person who's hearing, that you can associate a painful memory, a good memory, with sounds. That's very special. That's something I value, having that, being able to connect memories, good and bad, with sound and music.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to say that deaf people don't like music, because some deaf people who have more hearing do enjoy it. Personally, I'm quite profoundly deaf, and so I don't really associate with music the way that Len does. I think it's nice. I can feel the vibration sometimes. I might even dance to it if I can really sense it, but I don't understand it the way that a hearing person does, and it doesn't have the meaning or the emotional impact for me. But what does work for me is folk tales and stories that are passed on from generation to generation. And that's a strong part of our culture. Stories or jokes that are shared about deaf people's experiences. And when they're in sign, it's really beautiful. And it is a sense of music to the eyes. There's a sense of drama and emotion in those stories that's very touching. And I really enjoy watching some older deaf people sign. They have some beautiful stories to tell. It's very impressive. And even young people share those tales. It's interesting.
And as a hearing person, being able to use a telephone, being able to communicate with others, listening to a radio. How many of us see people today of all ages, running around Green Lake, wearing your iPod, exercising, studying, and of course using things like email and all the wonderful new technology where you're able to learn, interact with the computer on an auditory basis. And so all of that is extremely important to me as a hearing person.
Mm-hmm. Now, for deaf people, mobile pagers are the thing. God forbid a pager should break. I'd have to run to the store to get it fixed immediately. That's my lifeline. Now, of course, before pagers, we had TTYs. They've kind of become obsolete. Now we use video phones through either our computer screen or television, and we're able to see interpreters on the screen and communicate in sign language or communicate directly to a person in sign language with a video phone. It's really nice. My family is spread all over the country, and we're in touch, and we're able to have face-to-face communication, and it's as if they're there in the room with me. I'm able to see my sister's new dress for the wedding. She's able to talk to me about things, and it's really nice that we have that visual link with one another. Just yesterday, I was on the video phone, and for some reason it wasn't working. A friend of mine was trying to call me, and it wouldn't work, and I was freaking out. I had to talk with technical support to get it resolved as soon as possible because, again, that's another type of lifeline for me. That's crucial for my access to the world, my pager and my video phone. And yes, email too. I feel like finally the playing field has gotten to be more equal between a deaf and hearing person. We all have access. If I email someone, you don't know whether I'm deaf or hearing. And that's nice. I really like that aspect of it. Video phones I really enjoy because I can give someone one number. A hearing person doesn't necessarily know whether they're calling, when they call this number, whether they're calling a deaf or a hearing person. Maybe they think when they've reached the interpreter that they've actually reached my secretary and I'm a real VIP. Who knows? But it's the relay service that they're talking to. So I like that aspect of the technology.
And there are similarities. Remember, we talked about there's American culture as the larger umbrella of which deaf culture is a subset. And we identified 5, and I'm sure there's more. The first one we have is communication. And just think about, we use that word so often, it may be probably one of the most used words in our language. But when I think about the debate that's going on now about health care and and you think about the town hall meetings happening around the country and the people who are against and who are in favor, and then how we process that's just gobs of communication. And think about just that one topic, all of the forms of communication that we're utilizing about that topic. And we're animated and we're involved and we're learning, and that's been going on. That's a big part of our culture. It's been going on in many issues. So I think for both deaf and for hearing, and with deaf, 2 years ago, there was an opportunity for Gallaudet University to select a new president. They used a certain flawed process, and they came up with someone who was not the best candidate. It did not sit well with the deaf community, and it was probably the first time in the history of this nation that a group of people went outside mainstream media. And what happened is that the deaf community, those involved with the Gallaudet community, utilized YouTube and went and created their own media. And from that, it's happened a lot. But that was a major change in the way we communicate. Prior to that, we relied on mainstream media, and there was so much spinning going on politically that deaf people said, forget it, we're doing our own thing. And it just took off. And every night, people were watching the YouTube communication that was going out being produced by deaf people. They just forgot mainstream media. And it led to a halt of a process, and it forced the college to rethink its process, to rescind a decision they made, and move the process forward. And right now, the university is in the process of using a better way of going about. But my point is that as a hearing person, as a deaf person, we both have tremendous value on communication.
I want to add to those comments about communication, because we are social animals, all of us, deaf or hearing. We need to be able to communicate with other individuals. That's mandatory for life as a human. Now I want to talk about acquisition of language. Now, of course, you have to have language to communicate, right? So acquisition or learning of language, they found in research that the window of opportunity for that acquisition for an infant, whether deaf or hearing, begins at birth and continues until age 5. That is truly the most opportune time for a child to learn any language: French, English, Spanish, ASL, you name it. 0 through 5. Now, until a child is about 8 years old, from the age of 5 through 8 or 9, they still can acquire a language, but there's more struggle because our brains literally become more wired at that point. You know, you think of a computer hard drive, you have to feed data into the hard drive for programs to run, right? So whether the software that you're feeding it is sign language, so to speak, or a spoken language, it doesn't matter. It all has to get in there when those brains are young and agile between 0 and 5. Now, as an example, one of my daughters, well, both are hearing, but one of them, when she was 1.5, I clearly remember her sitting at the dinner table. My husband and I were sitting there signing to one another. And she looked at us and looked towards me, and she signed, "I've finished eating, can I get down?" essentially. And then she turned to my husband, and in English she said, "May I please be excused, I'm finished eating." So she clearly understood, Dad understands English, I know sign language, and she used both languages appropriately at 1.5 years old to ask, I'm finished eating, may I be excused? Both of my daughters signed beautifully because they acquired English and ASL at those appropriate ages. I think they signed beautifully, don't you? And as young as 1.5, they were able to understand the concept of 2 different languages and flow back and forth between the 2 without any trouble. I remember trying to learn Spanish in college, and oh my goodness, what a struggle. I mean, I could do it by rote memory, but did I ever become fluent in it? No, and I've completely forgotten it. Maybe I know a few words, uno, dos, tres, but that's about it. I'm able to remember some words when I see them, but if you don't use a language, you lose it. So language acquisition is crucial in both deaf and hearing cultures, but that 0 to 5 window is the most important. It's still possible between 5 and 8, but it is more challenging for a child to develop that language.
Family values, it's a term that I think has been used to mean a lot of things, but to me, family values, whether you're hearing or in deaf culture, in American culture, there are a lot of similarities. And, if you've not lived out of this country, you might assume, well, isn't it the same all over the world? And it's not. Again, having lived in another country that is much more impoverished than this country, the men eat first, the women eat second, the boys and girls eat third, and what's left is for the toddlers and infants. That's not what this culture does. American culture, whether you're in a hearing family or deaf family, you take care of your infants and we all give up for our little ones. And that is not different whether you're hearing or deaf. And there are other values in terms of education, being a decent, honest person, and from our perspective, you would find those values in both deaf and hearing culture.
And next, we're going to talk about the value of socialization. It may be via socializing via church, through friends gathering, family gatherings. We want to talk and socialize with other people. We network in our work environment, and that's true whether you're deaf or hearing. Socialization is very important. Don't you agree? Yes? Okay, great.
Okay, the last one that we selected in terms of common values between deaf and hearing cultures is democracy. Democracy simply is majority decides. However, in American democracy, minority rights are protected. And that's unique. I think it's one of the reasons a lot of people come to this country from other countries, is because minorities are protected. But that is a common value that's shared among deaf and hearing culture. There are many places around the world that if you're deaf, you know you don't go to school. You know you don't get educated. There are plenty of families who will send their children over here to be with relatives because they know that this is an American democracy, that individuals have rights, and in this country we have a right to an education. Those are elements of American democracy, and that is something that's shared with deaf and hearing culture.
Also, of course, as part of democracy, we have freedom of speech. We can criticize our president, who's been criticized a lot lately, actually, which is unfortunate. But in many other countries, that would never happen. You can be killed. You can be put in prison for speaking out against your government or for sharing your thoughts about the government. Deaf people have rights. Hearing people have rights. So we do find common ground there. All right, we would like to go a little further into the value of communication, and we've come up with three. Should I check with my interpreters? Does anyone need to change with one another? Are we doing okay? I think we're okay. All right. I have to be conscious of the interpreters. They're not robots. They're all working hard, and they have rights too. They have a right to spell each other. Anyhow. These are just hypothetical families that they're composites of families that we have actually met. And we're giving them the names, the apple, banana, and coconut family. Okay, so I'll begin with the apple family. We're two parents who have 3 children, 2 of whom are hearing and 1 is deaf. So everyone in the family is hearing except for 1 child. The parents did not learn sign language. The siblings did not learn sign language. The deaf child went to a residential school for the deaf where she learned to sign. But at home, communication happened via writing and reading, by writing notes to each other. And this child shared a story with me where she talked about being the invisible one in the family. Anytime she would come home on the weekend from her residential school, the family used some very rudimentary signs with her to say, it's time to eat, or let's go, let's get in the car. But she had no in-depth conversations with her family because of that lack of language access. If something happened to her at school, if something important took place, she couldn't share it with her own family members because they wouldn't understand her. And instead, she shared it with peers, which are not a replacement for family. And maybe it wasn't appropriate for her to share those stories with peers, but she had no choice. And she talked about being the invisible one in the family. And I thought that was very touching and very sad.
Okay, the next family is, we titled it the Banana Family. And the Banana Family has two parents who are deaf and two children who are hearing. And in that family situation, the father doesn't have any usable speech. The mother is more hard of hearing and has some usable speech, but they have not taught their children how to sign. And the children are maybe 9, 11 years old. And from my own personal observations, the communication is a real struggle. The mother has to kind of interpret what she thinks the kids are saying to the husband, and a lot of misunderstanding. One of the children gets upset. The mother doesn't understand. Mother isn't able to tell the father. The child gets frustrated, angry, walks away. So you're seeing a lot of communication missing, and you're beginning to see development of all kinds of issues and problems, and it's stemming from the communication that's missing.
The third family we call the coconut family. The parents and 3 children are all deaf. There is one hearing child, excuse me. And interpreter needs some clarification. Let me repeat that. There are 3 hearing children and 1 deaf child and 2 hearing parents. The father signs using C sign, like our interpreter up here, and the mother uses sort of a mix of signing exact English and American Sign Language, or what we'd call a contact language, Pidgin Sign English, which is a little bit of ASL with some English mixed in. The oldest brother in his family only uses finger spelling to communicate. He doesn't know sign, per se. One of the sisters, who's also hearing, grew up learning some sign at home, and then later went to school and took sign language classes where she became more fluent. So she's quite fluent. And then the deaf girl in the family signs fluently and uses a mix of sign English and ASL. Oh, forgive me, I had said 4 children. There's really only 3. So a boy that finger spells, a hearing girl who learned to sign later, and then the deaf girl who signs fluently. And when I saw this family, I was really moved, because even though their communication was not perfect and sometimes they struggled, they all took the time to communicate with one another and share information with the deaf daughter. They would let her know, we're having a discussion about dinner tonight. We wanted to just talk about which restaurant to go to. Your sister wants to go to Italian. What do you think? And she'd say, no, I want to go to Mexican. She was involved in all of the decisions that the family was making together. Even when communicating with a brother who could barely sign and a father who could barely sign, it didn't matter. They took the time to communicate with one another, and it really was striking what a difference it made. Whether it meant writing notes to be able to understand each other, or signing, or finger spelling, it didn't matter. There was no rudimentary communication. There wasn't just telling the daughter, go to bed, eat now, let's get in the car. They had discussions. They would talk about TV shows that they were watching. Now, compare that to the Apple family. When the deaf child would ask what's going on, she was told, just, we'll tell you later, we'll tell you later. And she was just kept out of all conversations. The Coconut family, the deaf girl, grew up, had very good communication skills. She now has a master's degree. She has a very good job. And I think it's because the family took the time to communicate with her. It didn't matter how they did it, they did it. They tried their best in any way they could. And I think that's truly the key. I talked about that window of opportunity for language acquisition, and my feeling is because English is an auditory language, I mean, it just happens to be an auditory language, much information is not easily understood by reading or writing. You need to learn the language by hearing it. So if parents decide they have a deaf child, perhaps they decide they want their child to have a cochlear implant, that's fine. But I don't recommend only using speech with that child, because people have a fear that if a child learns sign, they will lose their ability to learn speech or to lip read, and that's not true. Speech, you have to remember, is not language. English is a language. American Sign Language is a language. Speech is a way of expressing language. And remember, those crucial years between 0 and 5, whatever language it is that you're trying to expose a child to, English happens to be an auditory one and is more challenging for a deaf child. So using both sign and speech gives them the best opportunities. Oh, I stepped into Len's part. I'll let him take over.
Yeah, well, this may be the crux of the issue in everything we're doing in deaf education and services. Is speech is not language. So what is the relationship between speech and language? And if everything stayed the same, we could probably be more definitive. But things are constantly changing. And there's new technology, and there's new strategies and new approaches, and we're always learning. So it's very difficult to tie this one down. As an administrator, as a teacher, and when I worked at the School for the Deaf, I was the one who went over to Tucker Maxson Oral School in Portland and said, let's work together. And the gentleman who ran that school, who he and I became friends, was the son of 2 deaf people who worked at Gallaudet University. And of his family, his brother and sister worked in deaf ed, and he was the only one who went the oral approach. So he knew all about this stuff, what's going on with deafness, and how do we support parents to make good decisions. And so it's very complex, but I think it's important to be able to know what we're talking about. And when you talk about language, and we gave examples of those families, the apple, the banana, the coconut. In one situation, you had a deaf family that chose not to teach their children, deaf parents who chose not to teach their children how to sign. They're hurting. That doesn't really have to do with the children learning English and how to talk. They're not able, within the framework of that family, to communicate effectively, and the family's struggling. Again, the speech does not equal language. Hopefully, for any of you who are parents and you're working with therapists, whether it's here or other organizations, you become clear as to what it is you're talking about and how that fits into your family.
I want to just emphasize again that speech is a form of communication. It's a tool that we use to express ourselves, just as reading is a tool for understanding language. We could read French, English, Spanish, it doesn't matter what it is. Those are the languages. The mode is a written form. Speech is another tool that's used. So again, I really emphasize the use of early exposure and using all modes of communication possible. Reading, writing, speech, listening skills. You want your child to have a toolbox to be prepared to face the world, whether they're trying to use speech reading, which is not 100% perfect. Listening is not always perfect, no matter what your hearing level is. Being profoundly deaf, it's very difficult. It's not like the world is going to fall apart because a person is deaf and doesn't speak. There are other ways of getting around in the world. So it's just important that the child has a strong foundation in a language, and they will be fine.
Okay, family values. Let's see. Family dynamics, looking at hearing family. If you just have a hearing family with hearing kids, hearing parents, hearing kids, they have a choice as to how they want to communicate as a family. You sit down to dinner, mom and dad are talking. Are the children part of the conversation? Are they not part of the conversation? What happens when children speak? How do parents choose to interact? That has nothing to do with being hearing or deaf. That's just the dynamics of being in a family. If you're in a deaf family, it's the same decision. If your parents are deaf, the children are deaf, and we know plenty of them. And we know plenty that are, quote, dysfunctional, and plenty that are very functional and exciting to be a part of. So if you're in a deaf family, it's the same decision. Mom and dad or parents decide what kind of communication do they want to support in their family. For mixed hearing and deaf family, and what I meant by that, or what we meant by that, is that the parents are either, that the parents are hearing, the children are deaf, or vice versa. It is complex. It is tough. It is not easy. And Brenda and I have teased about, the fact that how we've gotten along ourselves. It would be misleading to say to you that it's the same thing. I think it's more challenging. You have to make decisions about the speed of the conversation, who gets involved, how things get repeated. If you're telling a joke in a story, you lost the moment. I mean, it is just very complicated. So in terms of family dynamics, we're all affected by it, but I would say that for the families that do have that mix, it just seems to be more challenging. And because it's more challenging, I believe that it involves parents to be intentional about what they're doing. It ain't just going to happen. And personally, I've worked with plenty of young deaf adults who opt not to be part of their family anymore. Their hearing family. Why should they? There's no reason to. That's awfully painful if you consider yourself to be good parents and your kid doesn't want to come home during vacation. I mean, that's a difficult pill to swallow. Stages of child development, just kind of as a way to think about the fact that there's dynamics in your family that require flexibility and parents to adapt. What's going on with the child, with the infant, is that they're very dependent. You have a toddler child, and you're looking at developing skills and fostering independence. The teens is that push and pull. How many of you have raised teens? Could you raise a hand? Okay. And some of you, I saw a smile like, it's like it does knock you to the side. I mean, it ain't the child, it's not the toddler, it's something different. And if you're fortunate that whatever that is comes back, and I think the young adult is saying, can I communicate with my parents? And that last stage is that adult age. And when we look at our children, we're wondering, do they value what we valued? It's like that whole notion of teaching your children what their values are, what their foundation is. The reason I mention this, the reason we put this down, is because these changes, you cannot be the same person who gave birth to that child or adopted that child. You can't behave the same when they're at some aspect of being a child or an adolescent. When they're pushing you away and you're already dealing with communication issues, it's only going to be a lot worse. And children, adolescents commit suicide, they go into drugs, they do all kinds of things that we don't have control over. Are there things that we can do to enhance our communication at home to keep that connection going? And then when they leave the home, as I'd mentioned before, you want your young adult to perhaps you want them to come back home for a short amount of time, not too long, but when they come home, you got to have a reason. They've got to be motivated. There's got to be a reason to come home. And if the communication's not there, it's highly unlikely they're going to want to come home. So again, I'm emphasizing the need for flexibility and realizing that things don't stay the same.
Over the years, I've heard many comments from people, and I thought I'd share some of them with you. Some families have a fear of allowing their child to become a part of the deaf community because they feel they will lose them. And as Len said, if you have good communication at home and strong family dynamics, your child will always want to come home. They will always value their family. Think about the Coconut family. That girl, she visits her family every year. Now she's an adult, she's independent, but she still cherishes her family and wants to visit with them. So it really is a myth that you would lose your deaf child to the deaf community.
I have the next one, which is that signing reduces the ability to learn to speak well. What I think Brenda and I can bring to the table, perhaps me in particular, having worked for years in education with children who are deaf and hard of hearing, is that that is a myth, that learning to sign will in fact negatively impact your ability to learn to speak. And I guess you're just going to have to, if you're a parent of a deaf child, you're going to have to reach out and hear the different stories and read the books, watch videos, talk with people, and come to your own conclusion on that. But it's easy for me to understand why people would think that, but it is part, to us, it's a myth.
I can give you one example. I grew up in an oral school, and I had to learn the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Now, did I understand what the words meant? No. Now, there was one word, one boy in my class, his name was Robert, very tall boy, and I was quite short. And I just remember him because he could actually reach the flag and pull it off of the flag holder. So we were learning, I pledge allegiance to the flag for which it stands, with Robert, overall. And I remember I thought, I would always look at him and think, man, why does he get such special treatment? Because he's so tall. And I would always, pledge, saying this thing, assuming that the word was Robert. And it wasn't until I got into high school when I was using sign language that I realized Robert is not in the Pledge of Allegiance. It's Republic, not Robert. I was so embarrassed. I hated that boy for years for no reason at all. I had to apologize to him when I met him years later because I was so embarrassed. Just learning things orally, I didn't understand what the words meant. And it wasn't until high school that I actually understood the Pledge of Allegiance. Anyhow, the next myth, did you finish with the last one?
Okay, signing reduces listening abilities. I think it becomes more of an issue of is the person engaged or not in what's being said, what's being communicated. So it's not that being able to sign would reduce your ability to listen. There is that when you are learning to speak and you're learning to listen, you want to be able to sort out sounds and make sense out of those sounds. But there's nothing that shows that learning how to sign decreases that ability.
In the case of someone who is losing their hearing, that may be a different story because you have to learn how you're listening again. Your mind has to adjust to that change, but I think that's the only difference. Now, the other myth is that the deaf community will insist its values take priority over your family's values, and that's really not true. I think everyone respects family values, whether it's a certain religion or beliefs or traditions as part of your ethnicity. I think what will happen is that a deaf person will learn the deaf community's values and add them as an adjunct to the values that they already have. But there's no reason to let go of the family's values or the family's beliefs. I believe that's a myth.
Okay, the last one that we identified is that the majority of people who sign are deaf and hard of hearing persons who never will learn or never learned how to speak. I think if you look at languages that are learned, at least in America, there are more people who have learned sign than actually have to use it. So there are more hearing people learning how to sign than actually the people who need to use sign. And it's also, I think, ironic, I think we both feel it's ironic, that there is so much emphasis, particularly in the public high schools, and now more and more parents who want to teach their children at infancy to be able to communicate with sign. And if you study language, you compare a visual language to an auditory-based language, and you look at things like gross motor and fine motor, it is a child at 8 months can do this for mommy, but can't say mommy. They can't say mommy till they're 12 months or come close to that. They can do this for cookie or do this for milk. And so if you value that early ability to communicate by giving them a gross motor form of communication, which is gesture and using your hands, you'll give them an opportunity to be more expressive early on than waiting for. We've done that with our children, and our children were able to communicate with us earlier than they should have, according to the developmental charts, because they had a visual language that they could use.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about people who are deaf or versus people who are hard of hearing. If you're hard of hearing, honestly, it's easier to learn to speak and listen or hear language. I remember in my school there were 10 kids, and I didn't understand the variations in hearing loss, but there were 2 of us who were really profoundly deaf, and the other students were hard of hearing. And I didn't understand it. I thought they were actually trying to trick some of us. Because some of these kids would be pulled out for speech class and then they'd be back within 30 minutes, whereas I would be pulled out and they would take hours. I would struggle with learning to speak, and I couldn't understand what the trick was that these other kids were learning. And I'd ask them, well, how is it you're learning speech so quickly? And they couldn't really explain it to me, but I remember one kid running out into the hall. It was a kind of a kid thing, but we would run out as the teacher left the room, and they were able to kind of stand away from their desk and then suddenly get back to their desk in time before the teacher returned to the room. And I could never understand why I was the only one getting caught doing this. But I was always waiting till I could see the teacher coming down the hall before I went back to my desk, whereas the other students could actually hear the teacher's footsteps before they could even see the teacher, and therefore they were able to get back to their desk in time. So I didn't really understand the differences between being deaf or being hard of hearing until I later went into a mainstream school, a public school, and one of my classmates, Robert, that same boy, he and I went out to a restaurant one night and we were having drinks one time in the afternoon, and he spoke to the waiter. And I was shocked that he actually spoke, and he told me he was hard of hearing. So then I said, well, who else is hard of hearing in the class? I didn't know this. And he said, everybody except you and that other deaf girl. And that was the first time I finally understood that, oh, okay, these other children were able to learn speech faster because they could hear it easier. They didn't struggle the way I did and the way my classmate did. And truly, it does influence your ability to learn speech depending on your hearing loss. Now, again, identity. I spoke earlier about considering myself deaf. Other people consider themselves hard of hearing, or they might identify as late deafened. Some people say they're hearing impaired. Whatever, those are just labels. These are just terms that people use. But since I use the term deaf, I think it's simply easier to define myself that way. I don't struggle with my identity. I do understand, though, that there are many people who are hard of hearing who do struggle with their identity because they sometimes are stuck between the 2 worlds. They maybe have very good access to communication when they're one-on-one with another person and they can speak to that person and lip read them, but in large groups they struggle. Whereas other times they may choose to be part of the deaf world and use sign language to communicate. But it can be hard to find your identity. I happen to have it fairly easy because I am profoundly deaf and I choose that identity. think Len already talked a little bit about the concept of big deaf and little deaf, or big D deaf was what we call it. Deaf with a big D is considered to be someone who's a member of the deaf culture. Someone who uses the term deaf with a smaller d is maybe someone who has a hearing loss but doesn't necessarily associate with deaf culture or identify with the language, American Sign Language, or the values that we spoke about earlier. So big D deaf cherish or use the values of the deaf community. But again, as I said earlier, there are subgroups. There are people who associate with one another because of their love of sports. There are deaf people that attend maybe the same churches together. Naturally, all groups break into smaller subgroups. I thought it'd be fun to share some of our own stories now that we've been married for 28 years. You know, naturally things have happened that have been quite entertaining over the years. First of all, Len's family had never met a deaf person until we started dating. And of course, it was quite shocking for them. Now, he's from a wonderful family, very open-minded, wonderful people. I think actually I have the best mother-in-law in the world. When I look at my sisters and their in-laws, even though they're married into deaf families, I think, wow, they've got it tough, man. They've got some of the mother-in-laws from hell. And I'm very lucky to have my mother-in-law. She is wonderful. And she's now, she'll be 94 years old next month. No, in October, will be 94. I love her. Anyhow, so when we started dating, over time, I was invited to eventually visit his family. His family's from Chicago, and we were in Rochester at that time, I believe, right? Or was it Texas? Oh, Texas, okay. So we were invited, I was invited to meet the family. I think it was for Len's birthday, and I thought, ooh, you know, this is kind of a big deal, meeting the family. And I was really excited about going to Chicago. I'd never been there before. It was kind of a free trip. I thought, sure, I'll go. So we got there. And I started meeting his family, all of whom were talking to each other. And you know, Len was doing a little interpreting for me so I could understand who was who and what was going on. And it got a little monotonous after a while. And they live in the suburbs of Chicago. And I really wanted to see the big city. I'm from New York myself, all right? I'm a New Yorker. So I'm very comfortable riding the subway, the bus, any form of public transportation is just no big deal for me. And so I said to Len, you know, hey, could we take a drive? Maybe there's one area that I was interested in checking out. And I love shopping. Len is not a shopper, which is probably a good thing. We were able to have a budget. But anyhow, I thought, you know, I wanted to check out this one area to go shopping. And Len agreed with me. So we let his parents know. I said, I was going to go take the bus to go shopping. And they looked so nervous. They said, you're going to take the bus, dear? Are you sure? And I said, don't worry, I'll figure it out. They were so concerned about me getting on a bus. And they said, please, if you go shopping, call us. We want to make sure that you get there okay. I'm thinking, how am I going to call you? At that time, we didn't even have TTYs in public places. And there was no way. There was no pagers or anything like that, you know. I thought, how can I possibly communicate with you? And I didn't want to offend his parents, of course. I was trying to be polite. I thought, okay, you want me to call you before I come back? Well, all right, why don't you write down your phone number for me? I thought, I'll have to ask some hearing person, I guess, to make the call. So anyway, I got on the bus and went off. I think it was probably near the Northeastern University area. And it was a really nice area. I spent the day out. And was ready to get back on the bus, and I thought, oh, I've got to remember to call his parents. So I looked around, and there were some really tough-looking guys at the bus stop. I didn't want to ask them. A couple other people looked a little too meek and too weird. And then I saw one man who just looked like the perfect, gentleman, very clean cut. He had a yarmulke on, and I thought, oh, okay, he looks pretty safe. I'm Jewish. He's Jewish. I guess that's okay. So I pointed to the phone number, and I tried to gesture, could you please call these people? I wrote their name down. Could you let them know that I'm getting on the bus, and I'm headed back home now? And he grabbed the phone and tried to hand it to me, the pay phone. I said, no. I gestured, I can't hear you. Talk for me. And he was really reluctant to do it. And of course, then I saw the bus coming, so I wanted to hurry up. And I gave him money. I dialed the phone, and I saw him pick up the phone. He spoke for a little while, and then he hung up the phone. So I figured everything was okay. He gave me the thumbs up. I got on the bus. I was very relieved that he was able to make the call for me. And when I got back to Len's parents' home, his parents were flipping out. They were, "Are you okay, Brenda? Are you all right? Are you safe?" And I said, "Yeah, I called you. What's the matter? Didn't you get the message? I'm fine." And they said, "Len, go to again, Len's taken off. He got in his car to look for you." I said, "What? What do you mean? I called. I'm okay. Why is he looking for me?" And they tried to explain to me what was going on. They were so upset. Now, of course, they didn't know any sign language at all, so we could not understand each other for the longest time. But finally, Len came back home. And I said, "What were you doing? Why were you looking for me? I had the gentleman call." Well, apparently what happened was he spoke Yiddish. All his mother understood was this man speaking this foreign language, and he heard the name Brenda, and that was it. Nothing more. And all they could think was, I'd been kidnapped by this strange man. And that was the end of that. I assumed he spoke English. What did I know?
Okay, lost in translation. A few years after us being together and having children, we attended a wonderful annual arts festival for deaf in Chicago. And it's held every April, and they invite deaf children from all over the United States to bring their art, whether it's performing art or fine art, and they have a competition, and it's a wonderful event and brings people together from all over the United States, including Hawaii and Alaska. And we were bringing our daughters and two students from the school where I worked, who had been invited to present their art. And so these two children were elementary age, our two children elementary age, and all four children were able to communicate very well because our daughters sign very well. So we went to the event, and there was an opening night, which was a wonderful ceremony. It's very hard to get people together who are deaf and do something special like this. It takes a tremendous amount of effort. And so it's the opening night to this 3-day festival competition. And I looked all over the room, and there are these tables that sit 8 to 10 people, and they're getting ready to open up the event and have a performance and then lead into the weekend activities. And I look and I see people from all over the United States. You got people from, like I said, Alaska, Eskimos, and they're performing dance, and people from Hawaii, and people from the north and east and the south, and it's just a wonderful event for young people to participate in. And you're assigned to tables, and so Brenda and I and our family and the two children who won, who were invited to participate, were sitting at the table with us, and another family. There was a father, there was our 4 kids with us, Brenda, myself, going around this table, another gentleman, his wife, and his 5-year-old daughter. And we're all sitting there communicating, and the only communication we see going on with the father and the mother and the daughter are the parents saying to the daughter, "Shh, shh, shh," because she was making some noise. There was very little communication going on. It was difficult to see that, but that's their family, that's their choice. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, of all the tables we could be at, meeting with people from all over the United States, I'm sitting at this table, and it's just a question of time until Brenda explodes. And I know it's going to happen. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm watching the kids talk on this side, and I'm seeing on this side no communication other than the parents constantly looking at the little girl saying, "Shh, shh, shh." And I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, all right, the evening's going on. I'm thinking, how long is Brenda going to be able to hold on this? And finally, Brenda leans in front of me and looks at the father and says, and signs, "Why don't you know how to sign to your daughter?" And I know that the father is going to look at me and say, what did she say? And here I am sitting going, all right, well, I'm the middle child in the family. I'm supposed to be a negotiator. Here it goes. It's Saturday night. Everyone's having a great time. And then at our table, the volcano's beginning to erupt. And I looked at him and I said, she said, why don't you know how to sign to your daughter? And he became upset, and mother became upset, and they got up and left. And I thought, all right, this is where we're at right now. It was a better night, actually, for us, because we just were able to enjoy being at the table. It was unfortunate. I don't know today if we would handle the situation the same way. I doubt it. But I think, that's part of the message we're hoping to deliver tonight, is that it's you as parents, it's you as your child and your family. How do you want to interact? And hopefully, if you aren't teaching your children sign, you won't be at the table with us. It's just difficult. So that's the Lost in Translation. Brenda has one, no habla español.
If I can just add to that story, don't forget also, while we were signing, the girl was watching us and was fascinated. She was actually trying to get her mother's attention to say, Mom, look at what they're doing. And they were literally trying to cover her face so she could not see a sign. And that was very upset. The fact that her parents saw us as freaks or lepers of that sort, it really was upsetting to me. So I just had to add that. Okay, the next story. No habla español. Funny. Len was very proud to have lived in Mexico for 6 months and learned Spanish and very easily interacted with Mexican people. I took it in college, as I said, and I've forgotten most of the language. But we ended up going on a cruise at one time, traveling to different countries, and we stopped in Cozumel. And at that point, we were really tired. We had been with the tour group and been going to a lot of places, and we wanted to do something independently without the group, just enjoy ourselves and go off into Cozumel and meet some of the people that live there, not just be part of the tours. So we took off, and we met a taxi driver, and Len was speaking Spanish to him, and the driver was sitting in the front, kind of gesturing that he didn't really seem to understand what Len was saying. So Len repeated what he'd said again, and the driver still seemed a little bit perplexed. And I think he really started becoming frustrated that he couldn't understand what Len was trying to say to him, and they kept going back and forth, and it was getting a little bit more angry, and he was ready to take off without us. And I gestured to him, I did this. Basically saying, we don't want to swim where all the tourists are swimming. We want to go off to a beautiful place that you know of and only you. And he understood. And, it was a little embarrassing. Len was not able to communicate clearly in Spanish. However, I was able to communicate clearly using gestures. And he brought us to a beautiful swimming area that was quite far away from where we had been. And we were worried about getting a taxi back because, of course, we had to catch the boat on time. And so we tried again, talking to a taxi driver, and the driver didn't understand, and he looked at me, and here we go again, gesturing with my clock, my watch. Can you come back at X time to take us back to the boat? He got it. We did fine. It was a little embarrassing, I think, for Len, He thought, forget about it. He's not going to come back. He didn't really understand you, Brenda. Well, we spent the afternoon swimming, and we stood there at the time that we had originally asked, and Len said, Brenda, come on, he's not going to show up. Sure enough, driver drove up. So gestures sometimes work even better than spoken language.
Okay, spaghetti or sin. Many members of our family are deaf, and we were invited to a wedding, and we arrived at the wedding. We were from out of town, and as we came into the church, it was a family member, a nephew of ours who was getting married, and he came up to me, it was just a few minutes before the wedding was going to begin, and he said, Len, are you willing to interpret for this wedding? Our interpreter got into a car accident, won't be here. At that time in my life, I was not anywhere close to being able to interpret, just use sign skills, for Brenda, myself, and friends. And it's 5 minutes before the wedding starts. It's a Catholic service. There's 150 people. Half the people are deaf, half are hearing. They're going to need someone to sign. And so I said, sure, I'll sign. I don't know how good it's going to be. I'm going to sign. So he said, fine. And, with our interpreters here, we emailed them the PowerPoint presentation. We met an hour and a half before. This was not the same situation. So again, being Jewish, I wasn't real familiar with the Catholic service, and I went up on the stage at the church, and it was a beautiful church, and people on this side of the room were deaf, and people on this side of the room were all hearing, and I stood over here, and the priest stood over here. We had no communication. I didn't know anything that was coming, and so I stood up, and I just did, as soon as the service began, I just did the best I could by finger spelling and try to do justice to what the priest is saying to the best of my ability to be able to stay up and be effective in communicating. And I thought I was doing okay, and then I came to a part where he said, and Jesus died for our sins. And being Jewish, the word sin isn't part of our liturgy or our theology, and I had never thought of the sign sin. And it wasn't the right time to be thinking about it. So I heard him say, and Jesus died for our sins, and I signed, and Jesus died for our, what I thought was sin, and I signed spaghetti. And at the moment that I signed it, it dawned on me I just signed spaghetti. Because I knew that sign, and I thought, what am I doing signing spaghetti? Well, I'm there trying not to react, and I'm looking at all the people in front of me who are going, well, half the people, the deaf are going, why is he talking about food? Why is he talking about food? And I'm watching all of this conversation, and the hearing people are watching the deaf people all talking to each other, and I'm standing up there turning bright red, and there's Brenda with her 3 sisters, all deaf, my worst critics about my ability to sign. And they're all going, they're all trying to talk to me, and I'm just trying to, disappear and be there at the same time. And so I just suck it up and, go forward. And of course, when the wedding was over, every deaf person had to come up and tell me that I signed the wrong sign and had to show me what the right sign was. I made it very clear that I don't do weddings. So that's our spaghetti or sin story.
We still laugh about this story. Of course, we laughed. The hearing people, it was sad because, of course, this is a very serious time, a wedding, and very formal, and here we were cracking up in the church. But anyhow. This is an embarrassing story for me. With our family, we decided to go to the Dominican Republic for vacation. So we flew there, and we really wanted to meet some local deaf people. And we asked around and found out that there's deaf people usually get together after church on the island. So our daughters wanted to go to the beach to relax. So Len and I decided to go on our own to meet the deaf community there. We drove to this church. And I was thinking, now, Dominican Republic, how are we going to communicate with deaf people? So I thought, I can pantomime, right? I can gesture, I can do it all. I had done it in Cozumel with a taxi driver. This is not going to be hard at all. So we get there, and I'm meeting deaf people, and I'm trying to explain, we from far, far away, we get in plane, we fly here. And I'm doing my best to make this big mime of the show. And then I realized deaf people are kind of looking at me funny, and they're starting to step out. People were actually leaving, and few people stayed, but I look over to my side, and I notice that there's a bunch of deaf people standing together, and they're signing in ASL to one another, American Sign Language. And those few who remained watching my story were just interested in the mime, basically, or maybe they didn't really have formal language themselves. And I was so embarrassed to find out that they use American Sign Language in the Dominican Republic. They thought I was just an idiot gesturing up there on stage, and they weren't that interested, thinking maybe I'm not really that intelligent. And they went off to talk to Len using ASL rather than stay and listen to my story and mime. So, my mistake.
Last story we wanted to share with you is just kind of maybe more of an observation on our part, is that one of our daughters who spent 4 months in Durban, South Africa, was with part of a group from the UW, and she was there, of course, with other students from the university. And when you go spend 4 months in another country as different as South Africa, you tend to stay together unless you're with escorts. You really stand out, and it can be dangerous. And so you really do spend a lot of time together. One of the days during that 4-month period, she was on the street, and she saw some South Africans on the corner signing to each other. And without hesitancy, like I talked about before, Shauna walked over and was able to initiate a conversation. They were thrilled. She was thrilled. Her friends were really impressed. And it's that contact, it's that connection that would only come from the fact that she had a deaf mom. Well, I mean, if she had learned sign language, she might have been motivated. But when it's instilled in you early on, you feel that very difficult to describe connection. Well, that's an amazing thing. It's a wonderful thing. Those individuals probably don't interact a lot with white students from the UW. And here one of them approached and initiated a conversation. And while they did not speak the same sign language, they both had that interest in trying to connect with each other. And so we know that our children have that tool or ability, so that wherever they go in the world, they're going to have the opportunity to make a unique connection with people who probably don't even have a connection with the bigger community where they live. So I mean, those are kind of situations that have happened to us because of our deaf and hearingness.
Also, you want to talk about the Philippines?
And also in the Philippines, our same daughter, Shauna, is working for 2 years in the Peace Corps, and she went there to teach, like many Peace Corps volunteers in education, to teach English as a second language in their high school. And while there, early on, I think she met a deaf person, and she was able to use her sign language, and they were so impressed that she knew how to sign so well that now she got pulled into an assignment where part of her volunteer job on Fridays is to work with older deaf high school students who are still trying to transition to their communities. But the point is, she has that skill, and that's because we didn't suppress and say, no, you can't learn sign. We're going to just emphasize speech, and you're going to have to find ways to communicate with your mom. And so really, if you can step back and look at that and realize that that's a powerful tool for a young person to have, particularly in their career. Okay, we have some closing remarks, and I'm going to mention something about resources, and then make sure you are able to write some questions for us. We hope that we've been able to emphasize that early and good exposure to language acquisition is crucial to the communication, the social well-being, whether you're exposed to reading, writing, signing, listening, and speech skills. As parents, that's a gift you can give your kids. It's a crime if you don't.
We also want to remind you that American Sign Language is a language just like any other language. Sorry, let me repeat myself. ASL is just like any other language. It's different than English, but it is still a good, valid, true language. And the value of the deaf identity is as important as language acquisition. You have to remember, a child who has a hearing aid or a cochlear implant is still a child first, and still a deaf child. they're not less than anyone else, they're not better than. It's important not to give the child that impression. Yes, they're deaf, and that's okay, or they're hard of hearing, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay. And the last point we have is, I think we told our stories with the hope that, if you have a hearing family and there's a deaf member, whether that deaf member is a child or a parent, it is a blessing. It's an opportunity to learn different ways to communicate and new culture for family members. Sure, you can define it as a disability. It's not the ability to hear. I mean, it would be hard to argue that that's not what deafness is. That's what deafness is. But if you can step back a little bit and say, in the life of our family, where do we want to be? If you can view that as I don't know if it's corny to say a blessing, but for any of you who have had something different in your family situation, if you can step back and look at that and say, okay, maybe we're not quite sure how to deal with this, but if we can talk to others, get information, begin to ask some very soul-searching questions. What kind of family do we want to have? Who are we? How do we want our kids to relate to each other? Do we want our kids to come back and visit us when they've left? What are we all about? And if you can view it that way, then having a deaf member can be viewed as a very positive event for your family.
Before we close, and we will have a break, we wanted to share with you some resources that are out there. These are wonderful resources. Can give this to you, but also share the information with you now. There's a listserv called Deaf Web that shares information of, by, and for deaf. It includes information for parents of deaf children. It's about jobs. It's about interpreting. Really, it's a wonderful website. The only drawback is that some of the information is a little bit outdated now, but in general, it really has a great, very robust list of resources on Deaf Web Washington.
The Hearing Speech Deafness Center, HSDC, is a unique organization housed in Seattle. It's a nonprofit, and it is a service center for deaf, hard of hearing people and their families. If you have a child who's deaf and you live in this area, it would be well worth your time to go to their website and visit their center. And then after that, the WSDS, Washington Sensory Disability Services. Many states have this. We have the Office of the State Public, the Office of Superintendent Public Instruction in Olympia, and they have many grants out there to fund special services. WSDS is one of their special services, and they have professionals who are housed around the state, and they work with blind, deaf, and deafblind, and they will work with you, particularly when you're struggling with issues with your public school. And they are a tremendous source of information. They do workshops, and they're there for you if you need them.
The next is the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services. They offer cradle-to-grave services for people who are deaf or hard of hearing and or their families. They provide information and referral. You can contact them via the website to get more information and to get any type of support you may need.
In terms of education, every state is mandated to have a full continuum of services. And what that means is you can attend the Washington School for the Deaf in Vancouver. You can attend cooperative schools in our public schools where you have school districts that have programs, and sometimes they invite other school districts, and so your children can attend those kinds of programs. There are private schools that you may end up paying for and there's a wide range of options within the private schools. So there are options. You're not limited to one way to go to school in the state of Washington. And the last one we have listed is HLA, which is Hearing Loss Association. It used to be referred to as SHHH. That was the old sign, and now they changed it to HLA. And for those of you who are involved in some way with hearing loss, but not necessarily wanting to be a part of the deaf community and all of that comes with it, HLA is more, at least from my personal experiences, people who are looking at assistive listening devices and how to access resources to make sure that you're able to participate in meetings and be involved and be educated, and to work the legislature. There are issues related to insurance and reimbursements for hearing aid technology and CI and all that kind of stuff, and it's very political and it ties to money, and HLA is more of that side of it. And again, as Brenda had mentioned, when there are issues in the state that are a threat, many times these organizations pull together and say, well, we don't normally talk to each other, but we need to now, because there's not a lot of us in any of these groups.
Right, and don't forget Children's Hospital.
Don't forget
We should
Children's
list that resource.
Yes. Children's Hospital is a fantastic resource. If you're in the Seattle area, you're extremely fortunate because of Children's, ADWAS in Seattle, deaf-blind services. If you live anywhere in the United States, you have a child who's deaf-blind, you move to Seattle. I mean, there's just some very unique things that happened here years ago that have just exploded and become a very resourceful place to live.
One other resource I'd like to add, maybe you can add to your list, is DBC, which stands for the Deaf Bilingual Coalition, DBC. And this really is a parent advocacy group. For example, if you're having trouble getting interpreters provided for your child in their school setting, or the school district is not supporting your choice of education for your child, this is a very strong consumer advocacy group, and they have a website, www.dbcusa.org. Let me say it again, www.dbcusa.org. If you're interested in that, we should add that to the list too. Okay. I apologize for the time. My goodness, we have really gone on. Here is our contact information. And I guess if we have any time left, I don't even know if we can allow you a break. And then it's 8 o'clock now, though. We finish at 9?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, why
No,
did we think
8.
it was 9? Oh, so much for that.
Yes.
So maybe what we could, is this one on? Maybe what we could do is just take a few questions, and then if you have other questions, maybe people could email you guys.
And we're happy to stay here if
And
it's
stay
open.
a little bit later. I know I really want a cookie, and so does anyone have just a
So sorry.
question they really wanna
Right, or
ask?
just let people go get their cookies, maybe.
And then
Can they
come
eat in
back?
here? Can they grab their cookies and
I'm
come
just
back
afraid
and
if
eat
people
here?
go get a cookie, they won't
you
come
lose 'em.
back. Because that's that time of night.
No, but they can. Are they allowed to eat in here?
Yeah.
Well,
So we had a question in the back.
About deaf residential schools, and how much you think that has affected some of the family dynamics and the parents and children that can't communicate. Because I know I'm from Alaska, and we had Native American residential schools for a number of years after the United States purchased Alaska. And when you take a child out of their home and their family, and you take them away and you educate them in a different way from whatever the rest of their family is doing, and then you shove them back again at age 18, there are problems. just by doing that, regardless of how quality the education was and regardless of how much everybody loved each other, the separation causes a problem just by itself. And many of the children that were brought up in these schools didn't have the generational connections that you develop living in a family, how to take care of your younger brothers and sisters so that when you have your own children, you know how to care for them and so on. Did something similar
Right.
like this happen in the deaf community?
Well, can I,
I'm going to summarize real quick for the audio. So the question is basically, how does the deaf community or deaf residential schools, based on your experience with residential schools for the Native Americans in Alaska, how does that impact the child's being able to maintain connection with their family and their family heritage if they're at residential schools and then are not being raised in the family environment, except for maybe weekends?
Right, and I just want to clarify how often you're imagining a child goes home from a residential school. What, in your experience, how often did they return home?
So in her instance, they didn't come home until like for 10 years. So they went to school and they didn't return until they were done with school.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay. So that experience is a little bit different than the state residential schools for the deaf. I know many, many years ago, children would only return home for the holidays from the deaf residential schools, maybe during spring break as well. But that's not true these days. Much more often, children are going home on weekends, every weekend. So they interact with their families, 2-3 days every week. Now, for myself, having been in residential school and then later in a mainstream school, the mainstream program did not work well for me given that this was before interpreting services and note-taking services, so I really struggled without the support services in a mainstream program. And I told my mother I really wanted to attend a residential school, and I loved it because I was able to join extracurricular activities. I could be a cheerleader. I could never have been a cheerleader in the public school because I didn't speak well enough. I joined clubs. My self-esteem went through the roof. I really was doing very well at school, and I loved it. And now I ask many other people who have attended residential schools or have children in residential schools, and they find the experience to be quite good too. I think mainly if you're thinking about the communication that takes place at school, and if the child has access to communication with their families as well, then it's a really nice balance. But honestly, if they don't have the same communication at home, children aren't thrilled to go home. It's very difficult for them and frustrating, and many of them don't want to go home even at holidays because they don't feel the families take the time to communicate with them. Now, it sounds like from what you've said, the Native American schools in Alaska are quite a different experience where you can't really compare. They're sort of an apples and oranges here because we're talking more about the access to communication, whereas a child in a residential school, a Native American child, still has access to communication whether they were at home or at school.
Yeah. I've been a School for the Deaf administrator for about 15 years in 4 different states. And I think, at one time the Schools for the Deaf played a tremendous role in public education because for all kinds of reasons. And they were written into statute in the late 1800s, and they were just, you had to have them. Today the world's different for all kinds of reasons. It seems to be that they're still very popular and important, particularly in states that don't have resources. If you have a child in a community in Omak or somewhere far away and you can't recruit an interpreter to come there, you're going to have this child sitting there not getting an education. I've traveled the state, and you'll see sometimes sign language interpreters are paid very lowly. They're not certified. They're sitting there with a sign book in front of them. The child's 10 years old. That's not right. It seems to me that if you're a parent of a deaf child, you have to really be an advocate. You have to be engaged and involved more so than perhaps the average parent, because Sometimes you'll be told by educational administrators, by teachers, everything's fine, the child's very involved, they're very happy, and you need to dig a little deeper and find out that might not be the case. You don't want to be judging and taking over necessarily the education for a child, because I've met plenty of young people, one of them just got up and left, who are very successful in life. They can articulate that at one time in their life they did education this way, they had signed exact English, at this point they had ASL, they had a cochlear implant, they kind of go to different, remember we talked about child development, the developmental stages, and so I think at some point you encourage more and more for that person to take more ownership of their education, which is a lot to ask. We don't ask that of children, of hearing parents don't ask that from their hearing children, to take that kind of an active role in their education. But I think when a child has a specific situation that makes them different than others,